Night Chill Audiobooks presents Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, written by John Barrett in 1994, read by James Ross Spencer. Chapter 5, The Inventor. The voice came over my shoulder like a murmuring breeze. "Oh, don't do that," it said. "Whatever you do, don't do that." I was standing at the sales counter in Clary's drugstore after breakfast one morning, and when I turned around, I was confronted by a scarecrow of a man. He had a long neck and a protruding Adam's apple. Lank brown hair hung over his forehead. The man's face reddened as if he'd been caught thinking out loud. It struck me that if either of us should have been embarrassed, I was the one. I had just asked the salesgirl what I should do about the crystallized ring of black scum that would not come off my toilet bowl. The girl had told me to use the steel wool. The man smiled self-consciously. "Steel wool leaves big scratches in the porcelain," he said. "Those are calcium deposits you got. It's from the water. You need to scrub them off with a red brick. A brick's harder than the calcium deposits, but it's not as hard as the porcelain, and it won't scratch it." I had seen this man several times before, right here in Clary's drugstore. He was one of the regulars who came in for breakfast every morning. Although we had never spoken before, I knew who he was. That was one of the main things about Clary's drugstore. It was a clearinghouse of information, a burst of gossip. Despite the permanent smell of burned bacon grease and the likelihood that Ruth or Lily would get the orders confused, Clary had a loyal breakfast and lunch clientele. People sauntered in, sidled in, or stumbled in, and their condition was duly noted over the tops of newspapers. Customers greeted one another from table to table or from table to soda fountain, and every word was overheard and passed along later. Patrons at any given moment might include a housewife, a real estate broker, a lawyer, an art student, and perhaps a pair of carpenters doing work in a townhouse down the street. One of the carpenters might be heard to say, "All we got to do today is seal up that doorway between her bedroom and his," and the news that a marital ice age had descended on a townhouse in question would be common coin by the end of the day. Overheard remarks were as much a commodity at Clary's drugstore as Goody's powder or Chilgarid. The man who told me to scrub my toilet bowl with a brick performed peculiar daily rituals at Clary's. He always ordered the same breakfast: eggs, bacon, a Bayer aspirin, and a glass of spirits of ammonia and Coca-Cola, but he didn't always consume it. Sometimes he just looked at it. He put both hands flat on the table as if to steady his gaze, and he'd stare at his plate. Then he would either begin to eat or get up without a word and walk out the door. The next day, Ruth would serve him the same breakfast and go back to her perch at the end of the soda fountain to take a drag on her cigarette and see what he would do. I, too, began to watch. Whenever he left without touching his food, Ruth would say to no one in particular, "Luther's not eating." She cleared his plate away and put his bill beside the cash register. From the remarks that followed these exits, I learned that the man's name was Luther Driggers, and that some years back he had achieved a certain prominence in Savannah. He had made a discovery involving a certain pesticide and its ability to pass through plastic that had led to the invention of the flea collar and the no-pest strip. In this respect, it could be said that Luther Driggers was the modern equivalent of Savannah's other famous inventor, Eli Whitney. As it happened, neither man had made a dime from his invention. Eli Whitney had carefully kept the cotton gin under wraps while he applied for a patent, but he made a tactful error when he allowed women to have a look at it, assuming that they would not understand what they were looking at. A male entrepreneur put on a dress one day and slept in with a group of women visitors, then went home and made his own cotton gin. Luther Drigger's case was complicated by his having been a government employee at the time he had made his discovery. Government employees had no monetary claim to their work. The only way Driggers could have profited was by secretly selling the pertinent information to a private manufacturer. While he wrestled with the moral pros and cons of doing just that, one of his colleagues beat him to it. Luther Driggers had a mournful expression, but his failure to make any money from the flea collar was not the only reason for it. His life seemed to be marked by a succession of unfortunate misadventures. His early marriage to his high school sweetheart had lasted little more than a year. Her father was the owner of a supermarket, and the girl's dowry consisted of a house and unlimited free groceries. When the marriage came to an end, the house and the groceries went with it. Luther moved into an old mortuary at the corner of Jones and Bull, where the first thing he did was to convert the tiled embalming room into a shower. Later, he sold some inherited property and bought an old townhouse. He leased the house to tenants and converted the carriage house behind it into living quarters for himself. In the process of renovation, he devoted considerable attention to one small design detail of the stairway, the so-called false step. The riser of the false step was 1 inch higher than the other steps so that it would trip up anybody unfamiliar with it and serve as a primitive burglar alarm. This was a device used in many old houses, but it proved to be a hazard for Driggers, since he generally arrived home in no shape to deal with normal stairs, let alone trick ones. Furthermore, once the stairs were built, he realized he overlooked a more important consideration, namely, where to put the stairway in the first place. He put it against the one wall that could have had windows and a view of the garden. As a result, the living room looked out onto a back alley and a big brown dumpster. It was while nursing a bruised shin suffered from a fall over the false step that Luther went one afternoon to the Wright Square post office to check the weight of a pound of marijuana he was about to buy. He wanted to make sure he was not being cheated. To his amazement, he was stopped at the door, his package was seized, and he was arrested. As the Savannah Evening Press explained in its coverage of the event, the post office had received a bomb threat only minutes before. The story said Luther's parcel contained slightly less than a pound of marijuana. Luther would have been shortchanged just as he feared. Luther's misfortunes pained his friends, particularly the headstrong Serena Dawes. Luther and Serena were an unlike pair. Serena was much older than Luther, and she spent most of her waking hours lounging in her four-poster bed, propped up against an embankment of tiny pillows. From her silken day, Serena would cajole Luther to fix her a drink, look for her stockings, answer the door, get some ice, hand her a comb, fluff up her pillows, and massage her ankles. Alternately, and without a hint of irony, she would exhort him to stand up for his rights. A lady, she would say in her most languid, multi-syllable drawl, expects a gentleman to take what belongs to him. Whenever Serena took this line, she was usually thinking about the proceeds from the flea collar and the no-pest strip. Serena had calculated what baubles those proceeds could have bought. Serena Von Dawes had been a celebrity beauty in her day. She was so alluring that Cecil Beaton had called her one of the most perfect natural beauties I've ever photographed. The daughter of a socially prominent lawyer from Atlanta, Serena had met the young Simon T. Dawes of Pittsburgh, grandson of a steel tycoon, while on vacation in Newport before the Second World War. Simon Dawes was smitten by Serena. Gossip columnists across the country breathlessly chronicled their whirlwind romance, but when the New York Daily News reported that the couple had become engaged, Dawes' mother, the formidable Theodora Cabot Dawes, telegraphed a hearty one-word comment that was blown up into headlines. "Son engaged? Absurd, says Mrs. Dawes. Mrs. Dawes' opposition to the engagement was rendered moot by a subsequent elopement of Simon and Serena. After their honeymoon at the Old DeSoto Hotel in Savannah, the newlyweds went back to live in Pittsburgh. As Mrs. Simon T. Dawes, Serena became an icon of upper-crust glamour in the 1930s and 1940s. Her photograph adorned full-page cigarette ads in Life magazine. The copy always carried a message to the effect that Mrs. Simon T. Dawes of Pittsburgh was a lady of refined taste, that she traveled first class and resided in presidential suites wherever she went. In the ad, Serena would be sitting in quiet splendor, her head tilted back and a wisp of smoke rising from the cigarette held her in fair hand. Beneath the serenity, however, there was fire, and Serena's mother-in-law knew it. The elder Mrs. Dawes did her best to bend Serena to her will. She admonished Serena to donate the fees from her endorsements to charity, and Serena did. But when Serena discovered that her mother-in-law secretly pocketed her own fees from such endorsements, she slapped the woman's face and called her a heathen bitch. The two women loathed each other. When Simon Dawes accidentally shot himself in the head and died, his mother took her revenge on Serena. The family affairs had been arranged so that the bulk of Simon's estate would circumvent Serena and go to their children. But Serena would not be outdone. She announced her intention to sell her mansion in Pittsburgh to a black family. A group of rich neighbors begged her to let them buy it first. She sold it to them for a king's ransom and moved to Savannah. It was in Savannah that Serena plunged headlong into middle age. She gained weight, indulged herself endlessly, and became the soul of pampered self-absorption. She spent most of her day in bed, holding court, drinking martinis and pink ladies, and playing with her white toy poodle Lulu. As much as Serena detested her former in-laws, she reveled in her connection to them. She never tired of telling people that the bed she lay in had once belonged to Algernon Dawes, the steel millionaire, and photographs of Daweses and Cabots stood sentry on the night table. A full-length portrait of her hated mother-in-law hung in the dining room, just as her own Cecil Beaton photographs adorned the walls of her bedroom. Serena thrived in this museum of her former self. She had a wardrobe that consisted mostly of shorty nightgowns and peignoirs. They revealed her still shapely legs and discreetly swathed her upper half in clouds of feathers and silk chiffon. She dyed her hair flaming red and painted her fingernails and toenails dark green. She bullied and wheedled. She railed and purred. She drawled and cussed and carried on. For emphasis, she threw objects across the room. Pillows, drinks, even Lulu the poodle. Every now and then she would sweep the Daweses and Cabots off the night table with an oath and send them crashing to the floor. Serena did not choose to mingle in Savannah's society, nor was she invited to do so, but Savannah's elite never tired of talking about her. She has no couples as callers, says a woman who lived a few houses down at Gordon Street. Only young men. You never see ladies going into her house at all. She is not, as far as I know, a member of any garden club. She's not neighborly. But after a fashion, Serena loved Luther, and Luther loved Serena. The unassuming, shy, and hapless Luther Driggers had a darker side. He was possessed by inner demons who showed themselves in disturbing ways. Chronic insomnia was one of them. Luther had once gone 9 days without falling asleep. Sleep, when it came, was rarely peaceful. Luther usually slept with his teeth and his fists tightly clenched. By morning he would awake with sore jaws and little crescent-shaped cuts in his palms. People worried about Luther's demons, but they were not so much concerned with the uneaten breakfasts or the lost sleep or the bleeding palms. They were fearful about something much more serious. It was rumored that Luther had in his possession a bottle of poison 500 times more deadly than arsenic, a poison so lethal that if he ever dumped it into the city's water supply, it will kill every man, woman, and child in Savannah. Years back, a delegation of nervous citizens had informed the police, and the police had searched Luther's house without finding anything. That satisfied no one, of course, and the rumors persisted. Luther certainly knew all about poisons and how to use them. He was a technician at the government insectary on the outskirts of Savannah. His job required that he sift through jugs of barn sweepings, sort out the weevils and beetles, and raise them in colonies so that he could test various insecticides on them. The difficult part of the job was the requirement that Luther inject insecticide into the chest cavities of the individual insects. This operation demanded the dexterity of a watchmaker. It was hard enough to do sober. With a hangover and tremors, it was nearly impossible. "God, it's tedious work," Luther said. Sometimes to relieve the boredom, Luther anesthetized ordinary houseflies and glued lengths of thread to their backs. When the flies awoke, they flew around, trailing the threads behind them. "It makes them easier to catch," he said. On occasion, Luther walked through downtown Savannah holding a dozen or more threads in his hand, each of different colors. Some people walked dogs. Luther walked flies. Now and then, when he visited friends, he took a few of the flies with him and let them loose in the living room. At other times, Luther passed the wings of a wasp on top of a fly's own wings to improve its aerodynamics, or he made one wing slightly shorter than the other so it would fly in circles the rest of its life. It was just this side of Luther, his quirky tinkering, that left people with a lingering uneasiness about whether he might one day pour his bottle of poison into Savannah's water supply. They worried about the most of all when his well-known demons got the better of him, and whenever Luther walked out of Clary's without eating breakfast, which he had been doing of late, it was a sign that his demons were a-stirring. This concern was uppermost in my mind, in fact, when Luther was explaining why I should scrub my toilet bowl with a brick. He was telling me about, of all things, Savannah's water supply. Savannah's water came from a limestone aquifer, he said. It was rich in calcium bicarbonate, which loses a molecule and turns into crystals of calcium carbonate when it dries. "Hey, listen," I want to say, "what's this I hear about you and a deadly poison?" But I didn't. I just thanked him for the advice. The next morning, when he sat down at the table next to me, I leaned over and gave him the news. "The brick worked," I said. "Thanks." "Good," he said. "You could have used a pumice stone instead. That would have done just as well as a brick." Ruth put Luther's breakfast in front of him, and as usual he began to stare at it. I noticed a bright green thread tied to the buttonhole of his lapel. It hung loosely down the front of his jacket. As Luther stared at his eggs, the green thread began to taunt. Then it swung counterclockwise and came to rest along his left shoulder. I stayed there for a moment, then lifted into the air as if caught it in an updraft. It hung aloft, still anchored to his lapel, then floated down and lay across his chest. Luther was oblivious to the movements of the thread and the antics of the fly at the end of it. He saw that I was watching him. "I don't know," he said with a sigh. "Sometimes I just can't face going through with breakfast." "I've noticed," I said. Luther blushed at the thought that his eating habits had been observed, and he started to eat. I have a deficiency of stomach acid, he said. It's not serious. It's called hypochlorhydria. I'm told Rasputin had the same condition, but I wouldn't know about that. All I know is that in times of stress, my gastric juices just quit on me and I can't digest food. But it passes. About these gastric juices, I said, have you been under a lot of tension lately? Well, sort of, Luther said. I'm working on something new. It's something that could make a lot of money if it works. The problem is I haven't got it to work yet. Luther paused for a moment, considering whether to let me into his confidence. Do you know what black lights are? He said. Those purple fluorescent lights that make things glow in the dark? Well, you know, a lot of bars have fish tanks illuminated with black lights. The purple tree down on Johnson Square does. I go to thinking what a shame it was that goldfish didn't glow in the dark. So I'm trying to find a way to make them glow. If they did glow, they look as if they were floating in air like giant fireflies. Just the kind of weird vision a guy gets drunk in a bar could spend hours looking at. I know I would. Every bar in America would have to have them. That's why I want to find a way to make them glow. Do you think you can? Well, I'm experimenting with fluorescent dye, he said. The first thing I did was dip the goldfish directly in the dye, and it killed them. Then I took a slower approach and poured a teaspoon of dye into the fish's tank and waited. After a week, a faint glow appeared on the gills and the tips of the fins, but it wasn't enough to make much of an impact in the bar. Little by little, I poured more dye into the water, but the fish didn't glow any brighter and the glow didn't spread to any other parts of the fish. All that happened was the pH factor of the water increased, and in a couple of days, the fish were dead. That's where I'm at right now. The fly had alighted on Luther's eyebrow. The green thread dangled down his cheek as if it were attached to a monocle. Drigger's golden glowfish, sure, why not? Fortunes have been built on things like that, and things that are less. I like it, I said. I hope you can make it happen. Well, I'll let you know, said Luther. Our conversation over the next few days were brief. Several times Luther just waved and gave me the thumbs up sign. On one occasion I thought I saw a small horsefly hovering over him. I could not tell whether it was attached by a thread, but it followed him up to the cash register, and when he left the premises he appeared to hold the door open for it. One morning, when I came into Clary's, he waved me over. I'm trying a new approach, he said. I'm mixing the fluorescent dye with fish food, and I'm beginning to see results. The gills and the fins tips are glowing pretty good, and there's even some fluorescence in the eyes and around the mouth. Luther told me he planned to go to the Purple Tree later that evening for the first public tryout. I was welcome to join him if I liked. I could meet him at the home of Serena Dawes at 10 o'clock, and the three of us would proceed to the Purple Tree together. At 10 o'clock sharp, Serena Dawes' maid, Maggie, came to the door of her townhouse. She showed me into a front parlor, which was furnished in a grand manner. French Empire furniture, heavy swag curtains, and plenty of gold leaf. Then she disappeared to the rear of the house to attend her mistress. Judging from the sound coming from that direction, Serena's appearance would be some time off. I could hear the high-pitched strains of a one-way conversation. "Put it back! Put it back!" she screeched. "It doesn't match, goddammit! Now hand me that other one. No, goddammit, that one! I can't wear these shoes. Maggie, you're hurting me. Well, be more careful next time, and listen to what I say. Did you call the police like I told you to? Did they catch those nasty little redneck bastards? Did they? They ought to shoot 'em, kill 'em. They nearly blew the goddamn house down. Luther, darling, hold the mirror higher so I can see. That's better. Lulu, come to Mama. Come to Mama, Lulu. Ooh, Mama's little love, Mama's little kissy-woo. Maggie, do something to my drink. Why can't you see the ice is melted? At 11 o'clock, I looked up to see a pair of pale and shapely legs supporting a tumult of pink marabou surmounted by a pitcher hat. Serena's fingernails were a greenish black. Her face was thrown into shadow by the wide-brimmed hat, but it still showed evidence of the vision it had once been. She smiled, and an even row of perfectly white teeth gleamed between two brilliant red lips. I am so desperately sorry to have kept you waiting, she purred in a soft, coquettish drawl. I do hope you will find it in your heart to forgive me, but I regret to say I have simply had no sleep. The dreadful little children from across the square threw a bomb under my bedroom window in the dead of night, and my nerves are still unsettled. My life is in constant danger. Why, Miss Dawes, said Maggie, it wasn't them churning out all. It was only Jim Williams shooting off a cap pistol. You know how he likes to get your goat, and it wasn't no death of night neither. It was at noontime. Decent people were still resting, said Serena, and it was not a toy pistol. You don't understand these things, Maggie. It was a fucking bomb. It nearly tore the goddamn side of the house, and I'm quite sure my bedroom is structurally unsolid as a result. And as for Jim Williams, that no-good, low-rent, middle Georgia redneck, I will fix his wagon. You wait and see. Luther appeared carrying a Chinese food takeout carton. Well, I've got the goldfish ready. Let's go. Serena insisted on making the circuit of local night spots rather than going directly to the Purple Tree. The effort of getting dressed warranted nothing less than a grand tour, she felt. We went first to the bar of the 1790 restaurant, then to the Pink House, then to the DeSoto Hilton. At each stop, Serena's frightened gathers around. She paid attention only to the men among them, flattering and bullying them by turns and fanning herself with her cocktail napkin. Oh, darling, you look so handsome. Dear me, I left my cigarettes in the car. Now be a love and go get them for me here. Take my keys. God damn, it's hot as a bitch in here. I swear I'll pass out unless someone turns up the air. Oh, goodness, look at that. My drink's all gone. I simply must have another. Why, thank you. My nerves are still shattered from that bomb attack last night. Haven't you heard? A disappointed lover blew a hole in my bedroom wall. I'm still too upset to talk about it. As the evening wore on, Luther became concerned that the fluorescence might wear off his goldfish and that might begin to fade. We need to get to the Purple Tree before it's too late, he said. Well, get there, darlings, Serena trilled, after we peek in at the Pirates' Cove. Luther opened the carton and sprinkled a little more fish food into it. After the Pirates' Cove, Serena insisted on a stop at Pinky Master's. Luther added more fish food. At Pinky Master's, several people peered into the carton. Goldfish, they say. So what? Come with us to the Purple Tree, said Luther. You'll see. They'll put another dose of fish food into the carton. When we finally reached the Purple Tree, it was 2:30, and our party of three had grown into a small crowd, with Serena at the center of it. Luther was content to look after his goldfish and become quietly drunk. In the black-lit darkness of the Purple Tree, Serena's face was all but invisible under her hat, except for her teeth, which were all aglow. If it wasn't a jealous lover, she said, then it could have been the mafia. They use explosives too, don't they? They give anything to get their hands on the magnificent jewels my late husband left me. He was one of the richest men in the world, as you all know. After the attack last night, I consider myself lucky to be alive. Luther, none too steady on his feet by this time, stepped behind the bar. Well, here goes, he said, and without further ceremony, he poured the goldfish into the tank. They plunged into the water in a burst of bright green bubbles. Luther held his breath as the bubbles rose and the water cleared. They're swimming around the tank. Brighter than the gills or the mouths of the eyes or the fins were the glowing intestines of 6 goldfish. Looping coiled knotted coils of light at the center of each of his fish. Luther could not believe it. Months of work had come to this, glowing goldfish guts. He had overfed the fish. A silence came over the patrons at the bar. "Darling," said Serena, "what the hell is that?" Others were quick to add their 2 cents. "Well, that's repulsive. It looks like X-ray fish. Yuck." Luther would not be consoled. "I don't care," he said. "It doesn't matter. I just don't care." He kept repeating, "I don't care," over and over, in response to any question. "Do you want another drink? Why should we do with the goldfish? Are they radioactive?" He gave the same answer. "I don't care." Luther was in no condition to drive, so after we left Serena calling out nighty-night on her doorstep, I got behind the wheel of his car, drove him home, and deposited him in the living room of his carriage house, the living room that looked out on the dumpster instead of the garden. The night air seemed to revive him a little. "I don't know why I ever fooled around with goldfish," he said. "I should have stuck to what I know best. Insects. It doesn't pay to try to change. I've often thought of changing my life completely, but it never works. I moved to Florida once, but I came back. I've got too much Savannah in me, I guess. My family's been here 7 generations, and after that long time, I suppose it gets into your genes. It's like the control insects at the laboratory. Did I ever tell you about them? Well, we kept a lot of insect colonies in big glass jars out there, some of them having been breeding for 25 years. That's 1,000 generations. All they know about life is what goes on inside their jar. They haven't been exposed to pesticides or pollution, so they haven't developed immunities or evolved in any way. They stay the same generation after generation. If we release them into the outside world, they die. I think something like that happened after 7 generations in Savannah. Savannah gets to be the only place you can live. We're like bugs in a jar." Luther excused himself and asked me to wait in the living room. He walked upstairs unsteadily, but with exaggerated care, negotiating the false step without mishap. I could hear him cross the floor overhead. A dresser drawer opened and closed. When he returned, he was carrying a brown bottle with a black screw cap. The bottle was filled with a white powder. "This is one way out," he said. "Sodium fluoroacetate. It's a poison, 500 times more lethal than arsenic." Luther held the bottle up to the light. It had a handwritten label that read Monsanto 3039. This is the same stuff the Finns dumped down the wells when the Russians invaded in 1939. The water in those wells is still undrinkable. I could kill damn near everybody in Savannah with this bottle. Tens of thousands of people, anyway. A smile played across Luther's lips as he gazed at the bottle. I was in charge of burying a lot of the stuff out on Oatland Island, where we closed down a laboratory years ago. I kept some of it for myself, though. More than enough. "Ever thought of using it?" I asked. "Sure, I've always said I used it if niggers moved into the house next door. Them niggers did move in next door and made a liar out of me." "Isn't it illegal to have it?" "Highly. That's why do you keep it?" "I just like the idea of it," Luther spoke in a taunting way, like a boy with an extra powerful slingshot. "Ever so often I hold it in my hand and I think, poof!" Luther handed me the bottle. As I looked at it, I held my breath for fear that the slightest leaking fumes would be lethal. I wonder what went through Luther's mind when he held this bottle and thought, poof. Then I thought I knew. He probably saw the people of Savannah dropping dead one by one, businessmen sitting on benches in Johnson Square, young revelers carousing on River Street, slow-moving black women holding umbrellas aloft against the hot summer sun, butlers carrying silver trays in the Oglethorpe Club, whores in hot pants on Montgomery Street, tourists lined up in front of Mrs. Wilkes' boarding house. He took the bottle back. It's an odorless, tasteless poison, he said. It kills without leaving a trace. Just a slight residue of fluoride, but no more than you could attribute to the use of fluoride toothpaste. The victim dies of a heart attack. It's the perfect murder weapon. Luther went to the front door and opened it. I took this as a sign that an evening was over, but as I stood up, he grabbed hold of the door and pulled it sharply upward. The door lifted completely off its hinges. Luther laid it down flat on the living room floor. This is more than just an ordinary door, he said. It's what's called a cooling board. Cooling boards are for laying out corpses and preparing them for burial. It's a typical feature of old houses. The front door doubles as a cooling board. My family's house have always had them, so I had one made for myself. When I go, they'll carry me out on this. Luther sat cross-legged on top of the cooling board door on the living room floor with the bottle of poison in his hand. Yes, I thought, and when you go, how many others will you take with you? Luther closed his eyes. A smile spread across his face. You know, I said, some people in Savannah, or at least some people in Clary's, are afraid you might dump that poison into the water supply someday. I know, he said. What if I were to grab that bottle out of your hands and run away with it? Oh, I'd just go back to Oatland Island and dig up some more, probably, said Luther. Whatever his intentions, Luther clearly relished the speculation about his sinister power. When you were a kid, I said, were you the type who pulled the wings off flies? No, he said, but I caught June bugs and tied balloons to them. The next morning at Clary's drugstore, Ruth set Luther's breakfast in front of him. His eggs, his bacon, his Bayer aspirin, and his glass of ammonia and Coca-Cola. Then she went back to the end of the soda fountain and took a drag on her cigarette. Ruth, Luther asked, do you think you can live without glowing goldfish? I can if you can, Luther, she answered. Luther ate a mouthful of eggs and then some bacon. He took a swallow of Coke and proceeded to finish his entire breakfast. He had a mournful but peaceful air. Luther ate, he slept, and the demons within him were still. His deadly bottle of poison would remain a harmless curiosity. Well, at least for now.